I think we're going to war for real.
I'll tell you one little story that I probably have never told anybody before.
We got hit with a NVA sapper company supported by infantry.
It's not easy, and that one was tough, but fortunately it worked out for us.
Welcome to War Stories, conversational military history. All right, what's going on, everyone? Preston Stewart and Sayre Payne with War Stories, joined today by Sebastian Junger. Sir, thank you so much for taking the time to do this.
My pleasure.
So we call War Stories, this podcast, conversational military history. It's a lot of conversations with veterans, which are all really unique and interesting. And then what we might say are military adjacent, authors, journalists. But you've kind of created your own, or I would put you in a unique category where you've not just done work about war and veterans, but it really looks like you genuinely care about those people, the men and women that you covered at those times.
Yeah, I think it should be pointed out that as humans, if you spend time with a group of people, and particularly if you spend time with a group of people in hardship or in danger, the bonds become extremely strong. And you know, there are many journalists who, way better journalists than me, who have spent not months like I have, but many, many years covering wars all over the world and also covering American forces. And they also care enormously. But because, you know, I'm not a New York Times or AP or Reuters journalist that is charged with strictly communicating the facts to the readership, you know, I'm independent and I can write more personally, and it's a different part of the sort of journalistic ecosystem. And so I think what you're seeing isn't so much that some other journalists don't care, it's that their jobs are defined in much more narrow ways that keep them from being involved personally the way I sometimes am.
That makes sense. Yeah, and I didn't thank you for adding a caveat to my terms there, but so I didn't mean to downplay what others have put out, but you know, between your Vets Town Hall and continuing to work with veterans, it's unique.
Yeah, it's certainly. And the other thing I guess is sort of obvious is that most journalistic assignments typically are not, you know, spend a year with a platoon in a corner of Afghanistan that no one cares about, right? That was my own personal project. Like, so I wasn't sent there by the New York Times. They really couldn't bankroll something like that. This was a personal thing. And so I actually wound up being sort of part of that, quote, family of that platoon in a way that, you know, Dexter Filkins or Carlotta Gall or any number of amazing journalists, like they just, that wasn't their assignment, right? And they that wasn't what happened. And so that I think some of the things I've done stateside around that topic and around those people and around vets is an outgrowth of that totally immersive experience that I had, and I should say immersive and subjective. Like Tim and I, my colleague, Tim Hetherington and I out there, we knew we couldn't be objective and we had no desire to be objective. We were trying to write a completely personal, subjective account and film about what soldiers experience. And so that, you know, that's completely a huge no-no if you're reporting for Reuters, right? Like you really have to strive for objectivity and neutrality, and we didn't even have to do that. So there's a lot of reasons that, you know, I wound up in a role afterwards that, you know, was a little different from the sort of like the amazing salaried journalists who just like, you know, like go from one war, one assignment to the next. It's brutal on their personal lives, on their bodies, on their everything. You know, I couldn't do it. Like I did what I could do.
But to that point, when you mentioned like the human side of things, that is the subjective element. And I think it's almost like the yin and the yang where you need both. We need to know the plain facts so that we as civilians and whatever in society can sort of digest what the heck's going on and make form our opinion on our own. That would be the goal. But at the same time, it's pretty callous because it just, all you hear is roadside bomb. Right. And it's just, and you don't have names associated with that. Those are just, it's so callous and detached. Whereas you're bringing the, in my opinion, well, especially, I just feel like you're sort of like the GWAT journalist, in my opinion, right? Where you've really embodied us and been a voice for a lot of our experience. I mean, when we were in Afghanistan, we were in the South from summer to summer, 2010 to 11 in Kandahar. And Restrepo came out right in the middle of that, or at least it came out on Netflix,
Right.
where every, mass appeal could get it. I think it was like January of 11, December of 10 sort of time frame is what I remember. But we were in country then, and our families were watching that. And yeah, it was the East and the valleys. It was a different fight than what we had, but just that platoon fight, that's what we were involved in, that company platoon level in the outpost. That was our life at that time when that documentary came out.
Yeah, and thanks for mentioning that. I was we were very proud of that film. So that's, you're exactly right. Like there is a sort of media ecosystem, and on the one hand, you have the complete, just the facts, ma'am, sort of level of AP and Reuters, where it isn't even artful language, right? I mean, it really is telegram style, like this is what happened in Nairobi today, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then you have this little bit richer, more substantive, more nuanced sort of newspaper reporting, right? I like the New York Times, the Washington Post, where, you got a little bit of a feel for the journalist, you get a much more of a feel for the people involved in the story. But it's still, there's a remove, right? And there must be, because we depend on journalists to be objective about the reality that we have to navigate, right? And if I'm reading a journalist who's like bitterly anti-war or bitterly pro-war, I'm like, you know what, you're filtering your facts. I don't quite trust the conclusions you're coming to. I'm going to find another news source. So you really have to be like a judge or a jury. You have to, as a journalist, you have your own opinions, but you have to not allow those opinions to affect the conclusions you come to, the facts that you report. And then finally, at the far other end, there's sort of the personal essay, right? Which is my book, War, Tribe, maybe also. There's so much personal in there that I'm just signaling to the reader, hey, look, like this is my experience and it's subjective. I encourage you to go to the New York Times, go to Reuters, but also this is what it feels like to be a human being in this situation. And when you take all of those things in together, you get a sort of complete diet, right? In terms of information, you get a sort of complete diet. And as an American citizen, or as just as a human being, you can come to some sort of terms of like what you think, how you feel about this current situation. And that's true for war. It's true for anything, any important social issue, poverty, drugs, immigration. I mean, you name it, all of it. Like we sort of depend on that full spectrum to get like a good human and rational understanding of the problems that we face as a society.
I think that personal side played really well in the global war on terror as well. Just because your experience in the Korangal was different than a unit 1 year later, or the same time in southern or northern Afghanistan. It changed. It wasn't a conventional battlefield where you could track like World War II and really write a book, start to finish. It was peaks and valleys, and I don't know if the personal experience is the best way to document it, but it's probably better than what we're used to.
Well, you could get someone who's way more experienced in sort of military analysis than I am, who could, write something very informative about, okay, tactically and strategically, what are we doing? What is the United States doing in the Korangal Valley? And there are answers to that, right? I mean, there are legitimate, rational answers. You can make a pretty good case, not a bulletproof case, but a pretty good case for our presence there for a while, right? That's not me, right? I'm not smart enough. I'm not experienced enough. That's not what I'm bringing to the table. But what I am bringing to the table is whether we should be in the Korangal or not, this is what it feels like to be in the Korangal, right? And, since I can't get into someone else's brain, unfortunately, I only have my own available to me. I can't really know if, Steedster was scared in a firefight. But I know what it feels like for me to be in a firefight. And I can say to my reader, look, this is what it feels like. Like, this is what it feels like to be scared, to have bullets snapping around your head. Like, this is the experience I'm having. Is it their experience? Not exactly, but it probably illuminates their experience to some degree. So I'm going to tell you what was going through my mind in those moments. And you never want the, as a journalist, if you mention yourself, you should only do so in order to illuminate the topic, right? You never want the reader to think that you think you're the topic, right? You don't want the story, you don't want the reader to think that you're using the story to illuminate you, right? It's the other way around. You talk about, missing your wife and kids, or that you're scared, or that, boy, does this suck, whatever. You can do that so that the reader has a deeper understanding of what many of the soldiers are going through. And as long as you're very clear that you are not the point, then I think as a journalist, you're sort of on safe ground in terms of being personal.
It's that layer of, it's the context and the depth of understanding when you have that personal involvement. And really what I like about your, I don't know if I want to call it storytelling or narrative, the way you write, but it is, again, it's that motif and theme of the human element that, and that's what I find so compelling, that these are everyday people. And that's as a kid of the 90s growing up and sort of idolizing that World War II generation, to me, and really any American story of our heroes, let's say, by and large, they were just everyday people, and they went off and they did incredible things. And then they came back and, raised the 2.5 kids, had to picket fence and a dog sort of thing. It wasn't, we're not supposed to be the professional army, really, of like a bunch of badasses. And I'm just speaking personally, because it's like a lot of the stuff that I hear nowadays with, like, let's say like the Navy SEAL type stuff and the jockos that are out there, it's almost like too hardcore for me. And I feel like it's hard to relate to, even for myself in a way. Like, I don't want to wake up at 4 a.m. I want to sleep in a little bit and drink coffee or whatever. And, I'm not that hardcore. And I'm almost afraid that it scares people off of the military, because I believe anybody can do it. Anybody can do it. There's a job for you. Every single person is good at least one thing, and the military will find a way to bring you a part of that team.
Right. And I feel like this society, maybe any society, but this is the only one I really know in depth. I feel like this society sort of fetishizes things, right? So we fetishized, for a while, we fetishized soldiers and special forces, right? And by fetishize, I mean a sort of an obsessive adulation, like obsessive and uncritical sort of adulation of them. We've fetishized guns in this society in a very bizarre way, right? I mean, it's like, really, people are obsessed with guns. I mean, I get it. I own a couple of guns myself. Like, I mean, I have no problem, right? But they're not an object of obsession. I don't quite get it. We've fetishized sort of like extreme male, sort of maleness or something. And I'm all for maleness, right? But when you sort of when you're focused on an extreme end of the spectrum, or an extreme end of the spectrum of femaleness, you're not really accounting for the vast majority of like human experience, where most of us are just in the freaking middle. I'm sorry. Like, right. We don't have shoulders at the here. We don't, whatever. Like, come on, man. That's not the only worthy way to be. And I don't know what that says about America. It's a very strange phase we're going through. I mean, my wife is the youngest of 12, so her father was quite old when she was born, and he fought in World War II, and he commanded a platoon and then a company all the way through the war, from North Africa through Italy, France, all the way to Austria. 3 years. Right? Wow. He was a just completely gentle soul, right? He wasn't some macho guy, right? I mean, and he got it done, right? He got, I think, a Silver Star. I mean, wounded, like, I mean, I won't tell his war stories. I mean, he never did, right? I mean, but he got it done, right? No braver person on the planet than he was. And, but you don't need to be a caricature of masculinity to do that. And in fact, I would say in some ways that caricature of masculinity actually gets in the way of real courage. One of my critiques of the obsession in firearms is that, very simple. It's like guns allow cowards to feel like heroes. It's too easy to feel like a hero with a gun in your pocket. It's a shortcut to feeling like a badass. That's the problem. That's the problem with it socially. The weapons themselves are innocent of any wrongdoing, but it's how we use them psychologically. It's like, it just allows too many cowards to think they're badasses, and that's never a good thing, right? We all know that never ends well.
There was a this is a really random aside, but like it has to do with Facebook, but there's like this dads group in this small town where I live, and their banner on the dads group, all you could see was, it was just like this silhouette of an AK-47, and it was like, come and take it. And it's supposed to be just the dad's group and the mom's group, right? It's like the mom's group talk about school and stuff, dad's group get rid of stuff in the front porch. Here's an old grill, $50. But meanwhile, and then we all have kids in the school system, but meanwhile, it's like this banner is like this AK-47, and it just seems like violent. And I raise an issue, like, I'm new here, and I was new here with small children, and I just raise the issue like, hey, what's this about? Like, why? I just don't get it. It has nothing to do with dads or where we live or anything. And it just created a giant shitstorm, really, of like, people challenging my manhood and all sorts of stuff, and like, oh, this guy's afraid of guns now, and oh, he's afraid of like pictures, snowflake type stuff. And it was really interesting to me, trying to be a casual observer of it all, really not trying to get into it, but observing this very visceral reaction to a sort of challenge of what's this about, and their really inability to explain what it's about too, by the way.
I feel like if you really believe in your own strength, you don't have to lead with that. You don't have to wear that on the outside as the first thing that another person knows about you. And so the corollary for me is that if someone who's doing that, who's leading with their propensity for aggression, which any photograph of a gun basically suggests, what they're really communicating is, I feel weak and I'm not sure of my own strength. Like, that's what that communicates to me, right? I mean, it's well known with dogs, like smaller dogs attack larger dogs, not because they think they can win, but it's because they think it's the only chance they got in a fight where they're completely outmatched, right? So the small little yippy dog goes after the Doberman Pinscher because it's a strategy that makes up for weakness, like smallness, right? And that to me is what a photograph of an AK-47 on a father's group. It's like a little yipping dog that was hoping desperately to scare off the dog that it knows could eat it in one bite, right? And that's why is American masculinity, particularly, I mean, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say, I'm guessing a lot of those dads on that group are conservatives. Like, why is American conservative masculinity so unsure of itself? I mean, it's sort of a heartbreaking question. I feel like giving them a hug, like, bro, it's okay. We're good.
It's a tension. It's a tension that I feel it, and I've been feeling it, and it's gotten more and more. The whole thing at the Capitol, it's just, and I don't know what to do with it, but it's definitely a real feeling that I have. And I don't want to sound judgmental or anything, but it's kind of like not everybody went after me. It was just a small group, right, of this bigger group, but they're a very loud and vocal bullying. They're kind of, they remind me of the hyenas on Lion King. And it's kind of like the people that, I mean, their cover page on their profile is still, it's like, never forget 9/11. And they're the type of people that wear like the back-to-back World War II champions. But not that serving in the military is the only way to be patriotic. I'm not saying that, but I am saying when you're in your kind of mid 40s-ish, when 9/11 did happen and you were like in your young 20s and like you were at the point to go and step off and do something about it, and you didn't, and you're still talking about it and dwelling on it and coming off as a tough guy now and coming off as super patriotic in a way, it really rubs me the wrong way. And I have those feelings, but it's just hard to know what to do with them, because I also know it's like, I don't want to say it doesn't matter, but like, what's the use of all my emotional energy to go, cause conflict? Because I don't want to cause conflict,
Well, I know someone and I'm involved in a project that's, researching what happened on January 6th and going through the people involved, such as they're known. and what got all these hundreds of people that were at the sort of most violent end of all this stuff. And what's really interesting is that, there was, I can't remember the percentage, 15% or something were, prior service, right? Virtually none of the people in the Capitol building who were prior service were actually in combat. I mean, virtually none. I'm thinking about it, right? Because their whole presentation is, yeah, we're combat vets, we're badasses, blah, blah, blah. You could say, I'm not a psychologist, right? But one could say that there was a massive act of overcompensation for a perceived inadequacy. Mm. In other words, these are guys who saw themselves and wanted to see themselves in a certain way, didn't actually get into combat to demonstrate their courage and their all this other good stuff that society needs, right? Didn't actually get to do it. And now here's a way for them to perform their courage in a way that where the costs are really insignificant, right? No one was shooting at them,
right?
Like no one, and so this is a sort of an overcompensation for what they think is a sort of lack of manhood. And so it's interesting to watch this sort of posturing in many American men who actually did not, like my father-in-law passed away, obviously. He didn't have to prove anything. Like he proved it with his feet. You know what I mean?
That's right.
North Africa to Austria, fighting every inch of the way. It's like, would he put an AK-47 on his website? Of course not. I mean, it was laughable, right?
Right.
So the one way to see those, you can, I think you can be almost certain that anyone doing that actually was never in combat, and that's the sort of the secret to it. There's some drilling out in my hallway. Are you picking that up?
A little bit, but it's not a big deal. Yeah.
I can put in my earphone. Like, if you want, I can put these things in.
Let's try them. Yeah, we'll see how that goes.
I'm trying to find the guy's name because I wish I knew it. You're talking about the riots and who did and didn't serve in combat, but one of the main guards there that did lead, like the protector of the innocents inside the building, he was in our brigade on deployment, and he was one of the Capitol guards that was shielding from the people coming in and all the innocents behind and navigating and leading them down to safety, putting his body in front. He was in our brigade on deployment. He's a strike soldier. Yeah. So that's a very proud moment to really, it's giving me goosebumps just talking about it right now, thinking about that.
Yeah. Oh, of course. Yeah. That's amazing. Yeah. I'm not surprised. It's
an interesting dynamic there, though, because, there are 17, 18-year-old kids wanting to join the military today. And one of the questions will be, do you think I'll see combat? Do you think I'll go to combat? And that's not on any, it's not something you choose. It ends up just happening. Think about how many Gulf War, between Vietnam and the Gulf War throughout the 80s, ladies and gentlemen served honorably. And they didn't miss combat. It wasn't a thing. They're not less for it. They're not less of a man, less of a woman. So it's interesting to think if somebody's trying to make up for that, it's not in their control to begin with.
That's right. But it's, our society doesn't have a good process for teenage boys to become men. There isn't a process that's recognized. And, I think women in some ways have less of a challenge. They are given a biological capability of bearing children that men are not given, right? I mean, even if you have a kid, you don't even necessarily know it's yours in the same way a woman knows that a child's hers, right? So there's this process for women that marks their passage into adulthood, where for men it's really more vague and it's socially defined. And so you can be a adult male and not a quote man. Right. I mean, just in the way the public talks about, man up, be a man about it. No one says woman up, be a woman about it. Women are assumed to be mature. Once you are, old enough to have children, once you're in your 20s or 30s as a woman, you're just assumed to be a mature adult, right? There's lots of guys who are 26, 36, who we all know you're not mature yet, man. You still got work to do, right? Like,
yeah.
And that's it, and it's because our society, unlike many small-scale tribal societies, we don't have a process for like, you got to do this, and then after you do this, you'll be considered an adult. You'll be allowed to get married. Like that. We don't have that moment, right? And so, absent that, service in the military and service in combat is sort of a stand-in for I have demonstrated that I will put my people ahead of my own personal interests. Like that's the ultimate definition of adulthood. It's like I come last. My children come first, my community comes first, my needs come last, right? And how do men demonstrate that? It's not obvious, particularly in a society that's safe, that's mechanized, that's highly technological, where most jobs in the society can be done by either sex. Like it's really hard to come up with a definition of what it means to be a man, and yet we use that phrase all the time, and so and it's not well defined. But I would say you're a man when you're prepared to put your safety and your comfort and your interests last, ahead of people that are vulnerable. And when you do that, you're a man. And it is really interesting, like when the Titanic went down, I was looking at some of the statistics of who lived and who died. And, there were extremely wealthy people, wealthy men on the Titanic, right? And this is a very patriarchal society. Sure. We all know, right? And there were millionaires, multimillionaires going down with the ship so that women in steerage, women and children in fourth class, right, literally sleeping among the crates in the cargo, right, could get on the lifeboats, right? That is our social definition of manhood. And, most of us are not in a situation where the boat's going down, so we cannot demonstrate our commitment to protecting the vulnerable, right? And so that's where that insecurity comes from, I think. I mean, there's this Duffel blog. You guys know Duffel blog, right?
Oh, yeah.
It's quite
Oh,
absurd.
yeah.
So they had, I think it was Duffel blog. They had this thing like, it was a sort of brief video thing. It was very funny. It was called the home invasion you've always dreamed of, right? And it was this guy in a suburb, right, who was like dying for someone to break into his home so he could protect his family, right? And it was, I'm guessing that the guy that they're, the character that they're creating in that little skit is probably not a guy who did 4 deployments in a whole bunch of combat in Helmand province, right? That guy doesn't need a home invasion, right? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's the guy who didn't have to endure combat that is still wondering about his manhood.
So it's a wet dream. I was going to say it's a wet dream for some people to think of that home invasion scenario. And something I just wanted to mention real quick before Preston asks his question is like, I remember listening, I'm a huge Sturgill Simpson fan, and he's a Navy veteran himself. And I remember listening to him, it was on Joe Rogan, and he was talking, someone broke into his multi-million-dollar mansion in Nashville. And he grew up kind of blue collar, literally working on the rails and all that after doing Navy. And he had an AR-15 pointed right at the criminal, but the criminal is like a 19-year-old kid that's kind of robbing VCRs. And he just said, and it was like, 2 or 3 in the morning. And he just says, "Hey, what are we doing here, man?"
Wow.
And the guy just kind of backed out and kind of walked away. He's, "What are we doing here, man?" Like, and he had a, red dot pointed right at his chest, had the guy dead to rights inside his house in Tennessee.
Right.
Broke in, all rights to do whatever he wanted.
A lesser man would have pulled the trigger.
That's right.
That's
right.
Yeah.
So it's April 11th when we're recording this, and your comments about men trying to prove themselves and put themselves in danger in place of others. Do you think that's played in at all to this concept of the Ukraine Foreign Legion, I think it's called? And I don't know if one American has made it over there or 1,000. It feels like every report's different, but there's been a lot of talk about that at least.
Yeah. Well, I think, let's talk about American men and then let's talk about Ukrainian men. I mean, first of all, I think there's a lot of American men who saw combat who miss it. And here's a chance for a righteous, what seems very much like a righteous war, like the Spanish Civil War, likewise, right? Like, I mean, it was democracy versus fascism. And my dad grew up in Spain. I mean, he fled in 1936 when Franco took over. My father and his family fled Spain for France. So, Spain's a country I know pretty well. And so, those righteous wars where you can go back and get some and not feel guilty about it. Like, of course, that's tempting to some guys, right? Yeah. And then I think there's probably a bunch of guys who never saw combat who are like, "Oh, this is my chance," right? I think there's guys who were in the rotunda on January 6th thinking, "I never got to see combat, but if we have a civil war in this country, that'll be my chance. I think some of the motivation for pitching our political situation as an imminent civil war, some of the motivation comes from the desire to like, see, prove yourself in the combat that you missed in Afghanistan and Iraq. So yeah, of course there's a bit of that, and but let's now go on to the Ukrainians, and let's just have a rational conversation about whether societies see real gender differences. There are many women serving incredibly bravely in the Ukrainian military, of course, right? But that society as a whole also decided that the bulk of women and children should be given the chance to flee and to a safe place, whereas men, it was illegal for men to leave the country. They had to stay and fight. And think about it like this: like young men men in general are completely expendable, right? I mean, you can kill half the population, half the male population, and a generation later, the population is at exactly the same level that it was before the killings, right? You kill half the women in a population, it takes generations to recover, if it ever does. So in World War I, had the casualties among soldiers, had those casualties all been women, Europe would still not have recovered its population levels from World War I, right? So, every society makes this choice, like the really dangerous jobs go to men because it doesn't matter when men get killed in a evolutionary sense, in a reproductive sense, it does not matter. I mean, that's why the men went down on the Titanic, and the women were prioritized for being saved. And so you saw that in Ukraine on a sort of country scale, at the scale of the entire country, like all the men stay and fight. Sorry, that's how it is, right? Women can stay or not; it's up to them. And so I think it's very important to sort of understand that, because of course men in this society, we live in a safe society for the most part, a comfortable, safe society for the most part. The Russians are not invading. And I have no doubt that if the Russians did invade, we'd be acting exactly like the Ukrainians. But how do you demonstrate your courage that any ordinary Ukrainian can demonstrate right now, right? How do you demonstrate it when you're living in a suburb of Baltimore? Whatever,
right.
There is no way. And that's where this dissatisfaction comes from.
You need a stressor almost. And it's like a product of our success, because those in World War II fought to keep everything at bay so that we didn't become a Ukraine later. And they didn't want, especially that generation coming up through the Great Depression, didn't want they wanted the comforts and everything. Yeah. That was, if we had it as hard as they did, they would have lost. Yeah. Because you're supposed to do hardship. I believe the whole point of having struggle and hardship is for an improvement later on down the road. Yeah. Whether it's for you personally as you're a better person, or you have better perspective, or it's the whole planting a tree that you'll never sit under its shade. It's to make it better for the next people. And they did that, but it also created, and we do have plenty of challenges, obviously, in this country, and lots of issues going on domestically, and there's infrastructure, so many areas of problem that aren't even global. They're all local in a sense, but it doesn't have to deal with life, limb, and eyesight at the end of the day. Right. And that's this weird contradiction, because at the same time, I don't want a bunch of Americans worried about the Germans coming and bombing, and we all got to get in the bunker downstairs and huddle together. It's like, but I also know if that were to happen, we'd be extremely united, and all these little petty things that we fight about, we wouldn't be fighting about anymore. I do know that. Yeah.
A very, very good friend of mine, I'm 60, he's a couple years older, he's really tough, strong, physically strong guy, really tough guy. He's worked outside his whole life, he's a carpenter, tough as nails, right? Nothing to worry about in terms of his manhood. And when we were talking about Ukraine, and he said, damn, he's like, I would like to think that if I were in that situation, I would stay and fight just like those guys. And I was like, it's pretty easy to picture you in a bunker, man. You don't have to worry about it. But this is a 63-year-old American guy, still wondering, like, do I have what it takes? And that's not because of toxic masculinity, and it's not because whatever. Like, that's a fundamental human and male concern. Like, am I prepared to lay my life down to protect the innocent, to protect the people I love? And if you have to do that, and you're lucky, they survive and you survive. And if you're unlucky, in some ways, if you're unlucky, you die wondering if you would do the right thing. I mean, that's the sort of tragic thing about this.
When I was finishing up your most recent book, Freedom, I thought, I feel like a lot of this applies to the war in Ukraine, and then stumbled across your article in Vanity Fair. So you actually, all of it does apply very, very well. I think.
Yeah. I mean, it's such an interesting idea. Like, why is it over and over in history? Why is it that underdog groups, smaller groups, can defeat larger ones, or smaller fighters in MMA or whatever or in the playground for that matter, can defeat larger fighters? Like, how does that work? And what do the smaller groups have in common that make them successful in defeating a great power? Right? I mean, the Montenegrins defeated the Ottomans in the early 1600s when the Ottoman armies invaded the tiny Principality of Montenegro. Outnumbered the Montenegrins 15-1, right? I mean, forget about Russia. That's 3-1, 5-1, something like that. No problem. 15-1, right? And the Montenegrins destroyed them, right? Killed a third of the Ottoman force and sent the rest packing. And it happened over and over again. Like, how the Irish against the English, in Ireland, and for that matter, the Americans against the Brits. And I mean, the Brits just keep getting their hat handed to them over and over again in these conflicts. It's quite funny, but. So, how does that work? And that's what my book Freedom is about. And that's exactly the Ukrainians, right? So you need a sort of noble cause, right? And freedom is the most obvious noble cause. It's so tied with human dignity and being able to be self-defining and have your own culture and make your own decisions. So freedom is the ultimate thing that people are willing to risk their lives for, to die for. Freedom not just for themselves, but for their loved ones. So you need a cause like that, right? And then you need leadership who is willing to die. If you have leadership that's hiding behind others, hoping to come out of this intact, your cause is not going to work, right? It's not going to fail. And then finally, often one of the common denominators is having women involved, grandmothers. Once you have grandmothers involved, once you have women involved in some of these movements, it means that the entire society is behind the movement, right? And even if you defeat them, it's like out wrestling someone and pinning them, right? Okay, now you got the guy pinned because you're bigger than him, right? But are you prepared to keep him pinned for the rest of your life? Maybe not, right? That might not work so well for you, right? He doesn't have any choices, right? So he's going to wait the rest of his life to throw you off. Are you prepared to hold him down the rest of your, most great powers, like the Russians, the Americans, the Brits, actually are not prepared to do that. We were prepared to do that for 20 years in Afghanistan. And we were finally like, okay, we're out of here. This is too tiring. Like, we're not into this anymore.
Do you find yourself drawn at all to doing any work in Ukraine, reporting, covering?
I stopped covering wars after my buddy Tim Hetherington got killed. He was my partner out at RESTREPO in the Korengal Valley. He was killed by a mortar round fired by Gaddafi's forces during the civil war in Libya, in the city of Misrata, an assignment I was supposed to be on. The last moment I couldn't go, he died. And ever since, I've sort of felt guilty that somehow I should have been there. I could have saved him. It should have been me, not him. Just a lot of painful thoughts that I know don't make sense, but still, I feel them. I know soldiers often have that from combat deaths of their friends as well. And so anyway, I stopped war reporting mostly because I saw what his death did to everyone who loved him. And suddenly I saw this kind of work is not as sort of heroic and noble, but actually in some ways quite selfish, because you're not gambling with your life. I mean, you are in a sense, but as soon as you're dead, it's over. The consequences are paid by everybody else. And that's, according to our working definition of manhood, that doesn't feel very manly, And so I stopped war reporting, and now I have a family. I have two little girls, age 5 and age 2, and I'm just not. I mean, I don't even cross the street against the green light, right? I mean, I was super careful because it's not, my life isn't my own. My life is theirs. My life belongs to my wife and to my children. And so, no, I'm not going to go over there. Do I miss the days when I could have had that option? Of course I do. Like, do I miss being 35? Yeah, of course I do, right? But I would never want to be 35 again. Like, I would never want to be over there right now. I definitely get the appeal, but I would just be terrified something would happen to me and my children would lose a father. That's all I would be able to think about.
That's the same exact answer I would give. Someone would ask me that same question. Hey, you're a former combat infantryman. You get the itch to go over there? It's that exact answer. And I don't know how people did it when they had children. It's like, I was lucky enough to just be married. We got, met in college and got, saying, you get engaged right after you commission, do your Army training, get married. A few months later, you ship out. That was my thing that I did, which is very typical. But we were lucky enough to not have kids. And I was already paranoid about my mom and my wife, right? If I were to die, that was the guilt that I really felt and carried, was like, I was concerned about dying for sort of what it would do to them in a way. But at the same time, I sort of accepted the fact that that's what helped me get through it. Accepting the fact that, look, it's just going to happen. You're better off accepting that and moving on. And so that gave me the courage to sort of run across those fields that maybe I shouldn't have, or do certain things with the bullets flying. But I don't know how I could to have done that with children back home, to be able to kind of block that from your mind and stuff, because you have to block it. You can't hesitate. That's the thing, is you have to run across that field. You do, whether you want to or not, you have to. You've got a job to do, and you cannot be thinking. You just got to do and be engaged in the present. And by the way, because I'm still trying to just process and think, because it's, it's dreamlike. I'm sure you have some of it's like, I can't believe some of this happened, but I think being in that hyper awareness, present in the moment, not thinking about the past, not thinking about the future, being so intensely aware of what is going on to the millisecond, I think that might be what creates that sort of time slowing response that happens in these scenarios where time does seem to slow when you're doing these things. And it's just this weird dreamlike trance and flow that you're sort of not even, it's like out of body experience in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, the idea of dying is terrifying if you really think about it. And so if you're in combat, the only thing you can do is figure out how to be in denial about that and not think about it. And frankly, people are in denial about their own mortality most of their lives, right? I mean, you can't, it's just too awe-inspiring. Mortality is too awe-inspiring to think about it for too long. You're not going to change the flat tire. You're not going to take the garbage out. How could you? If you're really thinking about that stuff. So, and combat sort of brings that into focus. I'm fortunate to be friends with an amazing person and writer named Karl Marlantes. And if I can channel Karl for a moment, he was a Vietnam vet. The real deal. I mean, really intense combat. He wrote an amazing novel called Matterhorn about his experiences. And so he said, he made the amazing point that combat recreates all of the experiences that religious thought, that religion is intended to produce in people. That you are in the moment, you are aware of your mortality, and yet you're prepared to give your life for others. And that's what religion is supposed to inspire, and often does. I'm an atheist, but it often does, right? Combat does that without having to drag God into it. It's just, it does that very naturally for almost everyone that's really in it. And so, and he's saying, there is a sort of, you can say that the combat experience is a kind of divine experience for those very, very specific reasons, along with, of course, the just horrific ugliness of killing and death and all that stuff.
It's the extremes. It's the extremes in every direction.
Yeah.
What I'd like to say, the luckiest, most fortunate part about my deployment was the fact that the Kindle existed, and I could take hundreds of books with me in a single device. And that helped me that's just how I'm a reader, how to process these sort of feelings. And I'm part masochist too. And so when I'm dealing with anxiety, I read Crime and Punishment over there, right?
Nice.
Something that I read Spark Notes for in high school just to get the grade. I didn't understand it, didn't want to read it, was not appealing to me when I was 17. But when I was over there, it's a different thing. And I read Matterhorn too. That's a part of this. Like I read that probably in December, like probably a month before Restrepo, processing all this. Because again, it came out around that era of 10 and 11. And I did read that and that's a guy Carl's a guy I would like to talk to just to kind of, because I related, his writings helped me as a young platoon leader when he's describing those feelings. And he had to show up sort of as a replacement, different sort of thing than what I was going through. Vietnam is a different war, but there's always those similarities of showing up as that second lieutenant and being in charge, but not being in charge at the same time, and having 2 left feet and that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, people do look to you.
Right.
And what you wear on your face and you resonate is extremely contagious. Right. And it's contagious in the sense of the positives or the negatives. And to me, it was just the most important job I'd probably ever do. I don't know. Like I'm the dad of 3 children, but it's almost more important than that because it was multiples, and that responsibility on those lives is a big deal. And him writing that into that book, I'm real thankful that he did that because it's not an easy thing to do.
Yeah. Yeah, I know he's a tremendous thinker, a tremendous person, an amazing writer. What It's Like to Go to War, another of Carl's books, is also like an amazing. Now, I remember bringing, the guys were so bored over there in the Korengal. This was like 2007. I'm not sure Kindle existed yet. I can't remember. But so I remember bringing this, 20 paperback books over there. I don't know if they ever read them, but I brought a ton of paperback books over there on one of my trips. Mm-hmm. At Restrepo, there was no internet. There was no, there was no cell service. There wasn't shit. Like they just had each other, right? And I remember at one point, and there was a lot of combat. So then when the combat would stop and there was no combat, no one knew what to do, right? And I remember the Lieutenant Gillespie, a super hot day. It was towards the end of the deployment. It was baking hot, flies all over the place, nothing to do. It sucked, right? And half the platoon was asleep, and in the middle of the morning, and Gillespie sort of shuffled past, like in shorts and flip-flops, and he was sort of muttering under his breath, "Oh, please, someone attack us today." And it's such an alien sentiment for civilians, right? They're like, "What? Are you kidding?" And that's what I wanted to communicate, is that how that thought could exist in a sane young man in combat.
Well, as we're getting ready to wrap up here, but I wanted to make sure we talked about the Veterans Town Hall, because I think it plays into that. Those thoughts that you can have at the top of an outpost in the Korengal don't make sense. They're funny, but at the end of the day, Lieutenant Gillespie is just a random person, a normal American. Can you talk a little bit about this? Is project the right way to put it for Veterans Town Hall?
Yeah, I mean, or initiative. I mean, it maybe hopefully one day a movement. Vetstownhall.org is the website, or you can go onto my website, sebastianjunger.com, and there's a page for Veterans Town Hall. Basically, the idea is taken from some of the ceremonies and rituals that are really commonplace in tribal societies, and particularly the Native Americans. So when combatants would come back from, you can imagine the warfare back then. I mean, this is tomahawks and clubs, bows and arrows, right? I mean, just imagine the psychological consequences, right? Mm-hmm. So these guys would come back, and the community, by definition, a sort of smaller organic community, the tribe, would gather around, and the warriors would have a chance to sing and dance and act out their exploits in combat. These are the things that they did for their people, to defend their people, right? And there was something, I think, I imagine that there was something enormously cathartic in that process for the warriors, but it also allowed, or even forced, the community to take moral responsibility for the acts of the warriors, right? I mean, once you're part of this process as a community, maybe you didn't draw the arrow and release it, right? But you are part of an organic whole that is allowing for that, right? That is supporting that will suffer consequences if that goes badly. You're part of that, right? So the Vets Town Hall is based on that idea. On Veterans Day, you open up the town hall in your town or your city and make it available to veterans who served in any capacity, in any war, regardless of their opinion, right, about the war. It doesn't matter. Any veteran has 10 minutes to speak from the heart about how serving in that war made them feel to their community. And if you like to say, I support the troops, which, some years ago was a very popular thing to say, even if it didn't mean much, that would mean showing up at the town hall and listening for half an hour, right? To 3 veterans in half an hour talking about how the war made them feel. It might be Vietnam. We've done a few where there were World War II vets talking, Afghanistan, Iraq. Some vets are furious they had to fight a war, right? Some are very proud. Some are so struck with grief that they can't even talk coherently. Grief about someone that they lost. But it allows the veteran to unburden themselves of their feelings and understand that the whole community is now a receptacle for the emotional consequences that war had for them, right? And the community is allowed or forced to participate in the consequences of war, both the good consequences and the bad consequences, and there are both. And so basically, if you go onto the website, it costs nothing to do it. You don't have to be a veteran to organize it. We have the template for the posters and whatever else you're going to need to start it. It's extremely simple. It's very cathartic. It's a profound experience for everybody, and I really recommend that you give it a try. We want 10 in every state, 100, 1,000 in every state. And I'll end with this. One of the benefits, I think, is not only an emotional, psychological benefit for the veteran, but it serves to bind communities together because, of course, there's liberals and conservatives listening in the crowd. There's anti-war, pro-war, whatever. There's everybody in the audience, and it makes us understand. We at the end of the day, we really are one community. We are one nation. It allows us to really live that truth rather than hiding behind our sort of silly partisan divisions.
It sounds almost like you're giving the veteran permission to share thoughts and feelings. I mean, in doing this podcast, we've noticed that folks have stories that you've never heard of or never thought of just because nobody's asked. They're not just going to start telling some crazy story, crazy as in silly. It doesn't mean bullets flying and explosions. It could just be something funny that happened. They don't just volunteer that, but eventually you get into a conversation and they open up. It sounds like it's the same type of experience. That's awesome.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And you realize that war involves every human experience, every human feeling, right? It's not just patriotism, or it's not just loathing of violence. It's everything. There's everything, those two things, and everything in between. And that's what I think the civilians who are particularly sort of like thinking politically about all this, they insist that war is one thing. It's your patriotic duty, or it must never happen. All violence is wrong. The blah blah blah. I mean, I grew up in a left-wing community, and I understand those sentiments, but some of them, frankly, are as absurd as sentiments on the far right. I mean, they're just useless, right? I kind of understand but it's useless. It's not a reasonable. It's like saying, you should never shout. I mean, okay, of course you should never shout. But we're human beings. We shout sometimes. Sorry. That's not the end of the story. What do you do when someone does shout? Then how do you carry on from there in a dignified way? That's the conversation.
And I just have to say one thing, just based off that whole violence thing, because I agree. It's like you don't want to crave it. Nobody wants it. But at the end of the day, humans, Homo sapiens, we're the most violent creature on Earth. So we have to recognize that fact.
Well, it's interesting. We're the most violent in terms of deliberate violence against others, deliberate group violence against others, right? Only humans and chimpanzees in some specific circumstances can do that. But we're also the most courageous. We are the only species that will risk our lives or sacrifice our lives for same-sex peers, right? I mean, most mammals will sacrifice their life to defend their young.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes their mate, not always. Sometimes their mate, right? But to die defending a same-sex peer who will go on to procreate and have children, and you won't because you threw yourself on the hand grenade. That's completely, I don't think Darwin knows what to make of that, right? Like, we're the only species that does that, and it's enormously noble. I find it, very, very moving that happens. It makes us utterly unique. So we have those two qualities. One very problematic, the other very inspiring.
I like it. Well, we're coming up on the hour mark here, so we'll go ahead and wrap up. But Sebastian Junger, thank you so much, sir, for taking the time to talk and for all the work you've done. It has made an impact and continues to do so on a lot of people.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed talking to you guys.
Yes, we definitely did. Thank you.
Yeah, take care.